Welcome to the Institute for Mediterranean Studies and Alexandria Center for Hellenistic Studies Neoplatonic lectures. We are very happy and greatly honored today that our speaker is Professor Anne Sheppard, who is Professor Emerita of Ancient Philosophy at Royal Holloway University of London, and also a honorary fellow of the Institute of Classical Studies in London and of Plato Center at Trinity College Dublin. Professor Sheppard has also taught at Oxford, her alma mater, but also the Open University and the University of Durham. Her research sheds light on the intersection of philosophy and literature, especially in the Neoplatonic tradition. She is mainly interested in Neoplatonic psychology and philosophy of mind, but also, of course, in aesthetics, as we all know. Her publications, approximately 10 books and more than 40 articles and book chapters, include, among others, 3 monographs, namely The Poetics of Fantasia, Imagination in Ancient Aesthetics by Bloomsbury in 2014, An Introduction to Aesthetics by Oxford University Press in 1987, and Studies on Essays 5 and 6 of Proclus' Commentary on the Republic by Van der Hoek and Ruprecht in 1980. She has edited or co-edited many volumes, including, among others, Ancient Approaches to Plato's Republic in 2013, Ancient Approaches to Plato's Timaeus in 2003, Studies on Porphyry in 2007, together with George Karamanolis, who is probably here or will be here, and who is going to open the fall lectures on Porphyry this year, and Greek and Roman Aesthetics by Cambridge University Press in 2010. Her translation of Plotinus, Enneads 1:8, on the nature and the source of evil is forthcoming with Parmenides Press, and she is currently working on a book provisionally entitled Drama, Dance, and Dialogue, Neoplatonic Views of the Theater. So today's talk on Catharsis and the Therapy of the Emotions in Iamblichus stems from her work in progress. There is a handout which I'm going to send now via the chat. And Professor Sheppard, dear Anne, thank you very much for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours.
Right. Okay. So thank you, Irini, for the invitation to give a talk in this wonderful series, and indeed thank you for setting it all up, the whole series, and for your very comprehensive introduction. So, like Jan Opsimer in his lecture last month, I'm going to talk about Iamblichus, and I'm going to discuss some material from his reply to Porphyry. That's a text which is better known under the not very helpful title of De Mysteriis, but I like Jan and others, I've been persuaded that we should be calling it the reply to Porphyry. I'm going to focus on 2 passages from Book 1, Chapter 11, and Book 3, Chapter 9, in which Iamblichus has some interesting things to say about art and the emotions. In 1.11, Iamblichus compares the benefits of watching and listening to ecstatic ritual with the effects of tragedy and comedy, which stabilize and purify the emotions, while in 3.9, he discusses the role of music in therapy of the emotions. And it's helpful, as I hope you'll see as I go on, to consider the second passage alongside 2 passages from Iamblichus' work on the Pythagorean life, chapter 15, particularly section 64, and chapter 25. I can see that Irini's now put the handout in the chat, you'll see that the two passages from the reply to Porphyry are numbers 1 and 2 on the handout. The first of the passages I mentioned from On the Pythagorean Life, the one from chapter 15, is number 3. I didn't put the passage from chapter 25 on the Pythagorean Life on the handout because it was getting a bit long with a lot of text, but the reference is there. However, I'm not going to dive into those texts immediately, because in order to understand these texts, we need to set them in the wider context of Neoplatonic views on ethics and on the education of the emotions. And to appreciate that wider context, we need to look both forwards to developments in Neoplatonism after the time of Iamblichus, and backwards to the origins of those developments in the work of Plato and Aristotle. So in the Neoplatonism of the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, we find an elaborate theory of a scale of virtues, which by the time of Olympiodorus and his Athenian contemporary Damasius encompassed up to 7 levels of virtue in all. At the bottom, there was natural virtue, physikē, aretē. Then there was what I think is best translated as habituated virtue or ethical virtue, ēthikē, aretē. Civic or political virtue, politikē, aretē. Purificatory virtue, cathartikē, aretē. Contemplative virtue, theoretikē, aretē. Exemplary virtue, paradigmatikē, aretē. And then at the top, there was hieratic virtue, hieratikē, aretē, which sometimes gets called theurgic virtue, theurgikē, aretē. So the full scale is used in the life of Proclus, written by Proclus' pupil and successor Marinus, and it's also set out pretty clearly in Olympiodorus' commentary on the Phaedo, 8:2-4, and Damasius' commentary in the Phaedo, 1:138-44. So if you go to number 4 on the handout, you'll see the references there for those passages, and yes, also a reference to the very full discussion of the history and development of the levels of virtue in Safri and Segond's Bude edition of Marinus. So that's the theory by the time you get to the latest Neoplatonists. The roots of this theory can be traced back to Plato and Aristotle, and the history of its development by the Neoplatonists, including Iamblichus' role in that development, is an interesting example of the way in which Neoplatonist theories became increasingly systematic and increasingly elaborate over time. It's no accident that the scale is set out in late Neoplatonic commentaries on the Phaedo, because it's in the Phaedo, in 67c to 69e, that Plato's Socrates distinguishes between the ordinary understanding of the virtues, based on a calculation of pleasures and pains, and the true virtue attained by the philosopher, who purifies his soul by practicing philosophy and paying no attention to bodily pleasures and pains. And there's a similar distinction between demotic virtue and the virtue of the true philosopher in the Republic at 500d, and also another passage in the Republic, 430c 2-3, which alludes to politikē Andrea, so political courage. Now, you know, as modern scholars of Plato, we might be a bit chary of putting all these passages together, but that's what the Neoplatonists do. They put it all together. They assume that the two levels, if that's what they are, of virtue distinguished in the Republic are the same as the distinction made in the levels distinguished in the Phaedo. So this is the origin of the Neoplatonic distinction between politikē and cathartikē aretē. But if that goes back to Plato, some of the other levels of virtue recall distinctions made by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle distinguishes physikē aretē, natural virtue, from kuria aretē, virtue properly so called, in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, Chapter 13. It's in 1144b 1-18. And I also think that Aristotle's account of habituation in Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, the first 4 chapters, together with his discussion of theoria in Book 10, Chapters 7-8, contains the seeds of the Neoplatonic distinction between natural virtue and habituated virtue at the bottom of the scale, and contemplative virtue higher up. So those Plato and Aristotle references are all at number 5 on the handout, as well as a reference to what I think is a really helpful discussion by Dominic O'Mara of habituated and civic virtue, or he calls it ethical and political virtue, in his book Platonopolis, indeed partly in reference to Iamblichus. And I was rather pleased after I'd thought, well, surely this goes back to Aristotle, to find that Dominic O'Mara thinks that too. So I'm in quite good company in saying that there are Aristotelian roots for this. The highest two levels of virtue in the late Neoplatonic scale of 7, that's exemplary and hieratic virtue, can also be presented as having some basis in Platonic texts. But of course, the full scale isn't found in Plato, or indeed in earlier Neoplatonists, or indeed in Aristotle. Plotinus in Ennead 1-2, that's number 19 in a chronological order, develops the distinction found in the Phaedo between civic and purificatory virtue, while Porphyry in Sententii 32 goes further and expands Plotinus 2 levels to 4. So as well as civic and purificatory virtues, Porphyry describes a third level at which the purified soul acts intellectually, and a fourth exemplary level. And I also, picked up from Dominic O'Mara the point that Plotinus does also allude to natural virtue in Ennead 1-3, that's the 20th one in the chronological order, Ennead 1-3, 6-18. So in a different context, but again, a later Neoplatonist trying to put all this together might well have picked up on that. And you can find the references to the Plotinus and Porphyry texts and at number 6 on the handout, and also to a couple of, I think, very good discussions of them, one by John Dillon, it's very nice to see here, and a recent discussion by Riccardo Chiaradonna. Okay, so you've got 2 levels in Plotinus, becomes 4 levels in Porphyry. Well, 2 levels in Plotinus and also mention of natural virtue. Porphyry expands Plotinus 2 levels to 4. It seems to have been Iamblichus who expanded the 4 levels found in Porphyry, the 4 levels of virtue, to a total of 7, fitting in natural and habituated virtue at the bottom, below civic virtue, and hieratic or theurgic virtue at the top, above contemplative and exemplary virtue. This expanded scale allowed for a composite picture into which many earlier philosophers' claims about virtue could be fitted. Aristotle's view that virtue lies in a mean, labelled metriopatheia, at least from the time of Diogenes Laertius, is associated with a 3rd level, that of civic virtue, while a transformed version of the Stoic ideal of apatheia is associated with a 4th level, that of purificatory virtue. And the relationship between the emotions and reason, or more generally between irrational and rational parts of the soul, is different at each level of virtue. The emotions have little or no part to play in purificatory virtue, let alone in the higher virtues beyond that level. However, at the civic level, at the level of civic virtue, education of the emotions is required so that we learn to feel them at the right time, in the right way, to the right extent, as with Aristotelian virtue. Habituated virtue, that's 1 level down, also requires training of the emotions, but since this is a pre-rational level, such training is better described as therapy than as education. So I think that for the Neoplatonists, training of the emotions is involved both at the level of habituated virtue and at the level of civic virtue, but at the level of civic virtue, there's a rational element as well, this learning to feel in the right way. So you can talk about that as education, whereas I think the right word for what's going on in their view at the level of habituation is more like therapy. Okay, so you might be wondering what all this has to do with Iamblichus' remarks about the effects of drama and of music in his reply to Porphyry. I hope to persuade you, as we now return to the text that I said I would focus on, that the ideas presented in those texts should be understood against the background of the scale of virtues and its ethical and educational implications. So let's now turn to reply to Porphyry I.11, to the first text on the handout. You'll see there are some words picked out in bold, and I'll talk about those as I discuss the text. The fact that some of the text is grayed out, that's a formatting error, so just ignore that. In reply to Porphyry I.11, after a general statement about the value of exercising emotions in a moderate way, metrios, Iamblichus compares the benefits of watching and listening to ecstatic ritual with the effects of tragedy and comedy, which stabilize and purify the emotions, making them, he says, more moderate. So metriōtera, So I think his use of the words metrios and metriōtera is very important, shows you what the context. It seems that he approves of tragic and comic catharsis because it produces metriopatheia. This passage has attracted a certain amount of interest as one of a small number of Neoplatonist references to Aristotle's definition of tragedy in the Poetics in chapter 6, 1449, b 24-7. Aristotle, as I'm sure you all know, talks about tragedy as producing a catharsis of pity and fear, but it's very unclear what that means. It seems that, like a number of modern interpreters of Aristotle, Iamblichus interpreted catharsis in terms of Aristotle's ethical theory. The same connection between tragic catharsis and metriopatheia also appears in passages of Proclus and Olympiodorus on the topic of catharsis in tragedy. I'm not going to say any more about those, or very much more about those today, but if you want to follow them up, the references are at number 7 on the handout. There's quite a longish passage in Proclus' commentary on the Republic and a rather short passage in Olympiodorus' commentary on the Gorgias. Whereas Iamblichus accepts that tragedy and comedy do indeed purify and stabilize our emotions, Proclus denies this because he wants to uphold Plato's view in the Republic that tragedy and comedy are psychologically harmful to us. Olympiodorus' position is less clear, but he seems to side with Proclus. It has sometimes been supposed that Iamblichus, Proclus, and Olympiodorus are evidence for lost Aristotelian material on catharsis, either from the missing second book of the Poetics or from the dialogue on the poets. And it's true that Iamblichus' mention of catharsis in comedy as well as tragedy might be thought to point in the direction of the missing second book of the Poetics, which was apparently about comedy. But I think it could equally well be due to Plato's targeting of both tragedy and comedy in his criticisms of drama in the Republic. So I don't see any need to appeal to lost Aristotelian texts to understand this passage of Iamblichus, or indeed the passages of Proclus and Olympiodorus that refer to catharsis, to tragic catharsis. And I think it's very unwise to treat any of these Neoplatonic philosophers as evidence for such missing texts. What the passage does offer us is evidence for a Neoplatonic interpretation of catharsis in ethical terms. So that's really what I'm interested in. It's what the Neoplatonists are doing with this idea. So I think the reply to Porphyry I.11 reflects Neoplatonic interpretation of Aristotle's Poetics. And the second passage I want to talk about, number 2 on the handout, book 3, chapter 9, reflects the tradition of considering music as therapy of the emotions, which goes back at least to Aristotle's mention of catharsis in his discussion of music in book 8 of the Politics, and probably earlier. In Politics 8, chapter 7, Aristotle considers what kind of musical modes, rhythms, and instruments should be used in education. And at 1341b32 to 1342b34, he notes that music can be used for catharsis as well as for entertainment and relaxation, associating such catharsis with the therapeutic effects of religious rites that were already mentioned in Plato in the Ion in 536c. Again, if you want the references here, they are on the handout at number 8, I think. Let me just check. Yes, number 8 is where I've got the references about Aristotle's Politics. So Aristotle goes on to discuss in detail the remarks made by Plato's Socrates in the Republic in book 3, 398c to 400, and he criticizes Plato for accepting the Phrygian mode while rejecting the aulos among musical instruments. In Aristotle's view, both the Phrygian mode and the aulos are orgiastic and arouse the emotions in an undesirable way, while the Dorian is a mean among modes, well suited to education. Now, scholars, including me, I have to say, have tried to use this passage to shed light on what Aristotle means by catharsis in the Poetics, but there are some significant differences. Not only is the focus here on music rather than drama, but also Aristotle distinguishes between the use of music for education and its use in therapeutic rites. So I've been persuaded by people who've commented when I presented some of this material in other places that really one should make a distinction here. And actually, I think the distinction, as you'll see, is quite helpful for understanding what Iamblichus is up to. So Aristotle is distinguishing the use of music for education and its use in therapeutic rites. And in the Politics, it's the latter, it's the use of music in therapeutic rites, rather than the former, the use of music for education, which is associated with catharsis. And now I'm going to kind of move forward a bit in time. by the time of Plutarch, the idea that music can be used for therapy of the emotions had become associated with Pythagoreanism. So there's a long history about music being used for therapy of the emotions. If you look at something like Andrew Barker's collection of texts on ancient music, there's lots of material on music for therapy of the emotions. It's not very clear when the association with Pythagoreanism starts, at least not to me, but it's certainly there by the time you get to Plutarch. In his work on Isis and Osiris, 384a, Plutarch refers to the Pythagoreans as using the sound of the lyre to charm and cure the emotional and irrational part of the soul, to empathes kai allogantes psyches. And again, in terms of references, I'm on number 9 on the handout now. While Sextus Empiricus, in his work against the mathematicians, 6.8, tells a story about Pythagoras using the aulos to sober up some drunken youths. So the one case is the lyre, in the other case the aulos, but in both cases it's Pythagoras or the Pythagoreans using music to as therapy for people's emotions. And similar stories appear much later in Olympiodorus and the other Alexandrian Neoplatonists. So again, there's some references on the handout. Turns up in Olympiodorus' commentary on the Gorgias, lecture 5, section 3. And then there are various other passages, later passages, which are conveniently collected in the translation by Jackson, Lycus and Tarrant of that commentary in note 161. And again, there's a discussion, particularly of the Olympiodorus, by another paper by Dominic O'Mara, in a paper called The Music of Philosophy in Late Antiquity. And again, I was rather pleased to find after I'd started thinking about this, that, again, I think I'm in excellent company. Dominic O'Mara and I are in agreement on this. He argues Olympiodorus regards Pythagorean music therapy as operating at the level of habituated virtue. And I think that's already there in Iamblichus, to anticipate a bit. Okay, so the stories told by Iamblichus about Pythagoras and on the Pythagorean life, this is going to number 3 on the handout now, on the Pythagorean life, chapter 15, section 64, and also in chapter 25, which I didn't put on the handout. These stories fit directly into this context. They're stories of a very similar kind. As you'll see, I think, if you look at the text that I've given you at number 3, about Protagoras deriving remission and complete recovery from diseases affecting body and soul, and making particular blends of melodies which transform the emotions. It's important to note here that all these stories concern the use of music to affect the emotions directly. And you'll see in the passage at number 3 on the handout that there's a whole list of emotions: grief, anger, pity, misplaced envy, fear, all kinds of desires, appetite, wanting, empty conceit, depression, violence, and they're described by Iamblichus as having arisen without reason, alogos. So in terms of the Neoplatonic scale of virtues, I think that what Pythagoras is described by Iamblichus as drawing his pupils is habituated virtue, which, just as in Aristotle, is a key preliminary to the higher levels of virtue that to some degree or other involve the use of reason. The use of music as therapy of the emotions also appears in Reply to Porphyry, book 3, chapter 9, going back now to the long text at number 2 on the handout, which is really, I guess, the main thing I want to focus on today. It's taken a while to get to it. But this time it forms part of a much more complex argument. Throughout book 3 of the Reply to Porphyry, Iamblichus argues that supernatural phenomena are not to be explained in human terms. And in chapter 9, when he comes to discuss divine possession into the asmos, in the context of religious rites, he quotes a passage from Porphyry's letter to Anebo, that's what you've got at the beginning of the text I've given you, a passage which refers to those who become possessed on hearing auloi, cymbals, tambourines, or some particular tune, such as the Corybantes, the devotees of Sabazius, or the worshippers of Cybele, the Great Mother. Now, as we've just seen, both Plato and Aristotle rejected the music of the aulos, and the Corybantes appear already in Plato's Ion as examples of religious possession. So there's a long history to those examples. To these traditional examples, Porphyry apparently added the music of cymbals and tambourines and the worship of Sabazius and Cybele, all of which may strike us as more typical of his time than of the classical period. Iamblichus' response to this passage of Porphyry is essentially that therapy of the emotions, uses the phrase metriōtera, healing the emotions, through music, is a product of human skill and nothing to do with the divine. By contrast, true religious possession is due to the kinship between musical harmony and the divine harmony of the universe. Iamblichus is concerned here to differentiate his own view from another view, which holds that the body and the soul interact with one another and with the tones. So in Greek, it's tosoma kai physikē elelos esti sympathē, kai sympaskē tois melisin. And I've put in bold the words sympathē and sympaskē because as you'll see, I think they're rather important. And he uses the terms aparasis, apokatharsis, and ēthikē, purging, purification, and cure. He also distinguishes a third view, which holds that the soul itself consists of harmony and rhythm. And he ends the chapter by emphasizing that the soul heard the divine harmony before it entered the body. So who's Iamblichus arguing with here, and what's he arguing about? One obvious answer is that he's arguing with Porphyry. And I have, don't much like referring to my own work, but I have discussed this passage in a previous paper quite a while ago. That's number 10 on the handout, a paper that was published in 2005 as part of a previous attempt to discuss Neoplatonic ideas on music therapy. And when I talked about it earlier, I suggested that the idea of music as therapy, as well as the views about the interaction of body and soul, using the language of catharsis, and the view that soul consists of harmony and rhythm, all came from Porphyry. But now I think things are rather more complicated. I don't think I got it quite right last time. Certainly Porphyry was familiar with the view that music could function as therapy for the emotions. His commentary on Ptolemy's harmonics includes a long fragment of Theophrastus, which contains a description of music as the movement of the soul that occurs in correspondence with its release from the evils due to the emotions. So that's number 11 on the handout. However, as we've just seen, Iamblichus is also familiar with that widespread idea about music as therapy of the emotions, and indeed he uses it himself in On the Pythagorean Life. So I don't think that in 3.9, Iamblichus is denying that music can function as therapy of the emotions. What he's saying is that that's something rather low level and is irrelevant to a proper understanding of divine possession. This seems to me entirely consistent with his use of the idea of music as therapy of the emotions in the work on the Pythagorean Life, and also with my own suggestion that, like later Neoplatonists, Iamblichus would see such therapy as operating at the pre-rational level of habituated virtue. Okay, so what about this view that Iamblichus is disagreeing with, which holds that the body and the soul interact with one another and with the tones? And which uses the terms aparasis, apokatharsis, and ēthikē, purging, purification, and cure. Is that also something that Iamblichus found in Porphyry? So in Porphyry Sententii 32, lines 16 to 18, when he's talking about purificatory virtue, so now I'm going up the scale, this is the one that's above the civic virtue. When Porphyry is talking about purificatory virtue, that's said to consist in apochēton metatou somatos praxion kai sympatheion ton prosautor, abstention from actions in concert with the body and participating in the emotions that affect it. And you can see this. Yes, I put this at number 12, 12A on the handout. It's the Porphyry that I think is relevant. And in lines 25 to 26 of Sententii 32, so phrosyne at the purificatory level is defined as me homopathein, not sharing in emotions. So Porphyry here is following Plotinus, who in Ennead 1-2, chapter 5, line 11, describes the purified soul as diminishing pains by not suffering along with the body. So that's 12b on the handout. The Greek, it's tas algezenas elatus to thesan to me sympaskein. So if you go the other way, you go to purificatory virtue. Plotinus and Porphyry want to say sympaskein is not going on there. It seems reasonable to infer that Plotinus and Porphyry would hold that at levels below that of purificatory virtue, the soul does share in the emotions of the body, and that they would use the words sympaskein, sympatheis, and sympatheia in this context. So I'm saying if they're so concerned when they talk about purificatory virtue to say that there isn't sympatheia, then I infer that they would say there is sympatheia at the level of I guess at the level of civic virtue, and certainly down at the level of habituated virtue. Did Porphyry also describe the music therapy which Iamblichus regards a pretty low-level affair as catharsis? Well, perhaps he did, but, and this is what I didn't see when I talked about this passage a number of years ago, if he did that, he was doing no more than following Aristotle in Politics, Book 8. Iamblichus is arguing with Aristotle here as well as with Porphyry. He sees that Politics 8 is about catharsis and religious rites, but he disagrees profoundly with Aristotle's account of these. Iamblichus wants to distinguish between the use of music as therapy in contexts where only human skill is involved, where indeed talk of the soul sharing the emotions of the body, sum pascein, may be appropriate, as may the language of healing and catharsis. So he wants to distinguish in all of that on the one hand, and on the other true religious possession, which according to him is due to the kinship between musical harmony and the divine harmony of the universe. Iamblichus' use of the noun apokatharsis, which again I put in bold on the handout, his use of that noun in 3.9 is consistent with his use of the verb apokathairo, or the middle apokathairomai in 1.11. His use of the word ēthikē, healing, suggests that he's thinking of this kind of catharsis in medical, if not physiological terms, and then it does become quite physiological with his use of the word aperasis, which literally means vomiting or spitting out, and is also found in the discussion of catharsis in tragedy in Proctor's commentary on Plato's Republic, in the passage that the reference is at number 7 on the handout. The idea that the soul itself consists of harmony and rhythm, mentioned at the end of 3.9, seems to be distinct from the view about the sympatheia, body and soul. Perhaps this was also something which Iamblichus found in Porphyry, but it may or may not be Porphyry's own view. In any case, Iamblichus is at pains to differentiate his view from this. He argues that divine possession properly understood is due to the kinship between musical harmony and the divine harmony of the universe. Now, of course, Iamblichus in the reply to Porphyry is defending theurgy, which is often regarded as some kind of intrusion into the Platonic philosophical tradition. But much of his defense is based on that tradition. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to defend theurgy as being okay for people who are good Platonists. And this passage is no exception. Greek and Roman thinking about music included two strands, which are both regarded as Pythagorean. So I've been talking a little bit about the tradition of music as therapy of the emotions and saying that's Pythagorean, but there's another kind of Pythagorean music as well, a bit confusing. And for Platonists, that has its roots in Plato's Timaeus and Republic, and this is the tradition which emphasized the parallel between music and mathematics. When Timaeus in the Platonic dialogue that bears his name describes the formation of the world's soul, he explains how it's composed according to a mathematical formula, putting together the circles of the same and the different. That mathematical formula is expressed in terms of intervals on a musical scale, implying a parallel between the structure of the soul and the formal structures of music. So this is all in Timaeus 34 to 37, particularly 35b to 36b, which is where you get the mathematical formula. According to Timaeus, the structure of individual souls is parallel to that of the world soul, but because they are in mortal bodies, in them the circles of the same and the different become disturbed and disordered. And that's all developed at Timaeus 42e to 44a. Quite a lot later in the Timaeus, it appears at 69c to 72d that it's a rational part of the soul, which is composed of the circles of the same and the different, and the lower parts of the soul, so sumos and epithumaitikon, spirit and desire, just as in the Republic, are said to be located in specific parts of the human body. At 47d to e, Timaeus describes music as having the power to restore order and harmony to souls whose circles have become disordered. And again, that's rather a lot of Timaeus references. They're all at number 13 on the handout, along with the Republic references I'm about to talk about. So the same view of music that you find in the Timaeus is just hinted at in two passages of the Republic. In Book 7, 531a to c, Socrates talks about a type of harmonics, which is a branch of mathematics, while in Book 10, 617b in the Myth of there's an allusion to the idea that on each of the 8 concentric spheres, of which, according to that myth, the world is composed, there sits a siren who emits a single musical note. The combined sound made by these 8 sounds is what was later known as the music of the spheres. a third passage that occurs much earlier in the Republic, in Book 3, 401d to 402c, on the right kind of response to music, in which a young guardian who's been correctly educated, once they become rational, welcomes, and the verb is aspadzoito, and recognize the affinity, the oikeotes, between their soul and true beauty, could also be read as alluding to the parallels between harmony in the soul and divine harmony. And you'll see in a minute why I'm picking out the particular words used there. Now, in Iamblichus on the Pythagorean life, the passage that I've been talking about so far, number 3 on the handout, in chapter 15, section 64, that's followed immediately by an account of a quite different use of music by Pythagoras, reflecting Pythagoras' own exceptional understanding of the music of the spheres. So the whole passage is in section 65 to 67 of chapter 15, but I put the key part of it at number 14 in the handout. This is 65 down to 66.5, and I'm just going to read you the translation of this. He, that's Pythagoras, no longer used musical instruments or songs to create order in himself. Through some unutterable, almost inconceivable likeness to the gods, his hearing and his mind were intent upon the celestial harmonies of the cosmos. It seemed as if he alone could hear and understand the universal harmony and music of the spheres and of the stars which move within them. Uttering a song more complete and satisfying than any human melody, composed of subtly varied sounds of motion and speeds and sizes and positions, organized in a logical and harmonious relation to each other, and achieving a melodious circuit of subtle and exceptional beauty. Refreshed by this, and by regulating and exercising the reasoning powers of his mind, ton tu nu logon in the Greek, thereby, he conceived the idea of giving his disciples some image of these things, imitating them so far as it was possible through musical instruments or the unaccompanied voice. So there's Pythagoras understands the music of the spheres, is able to give his disciples some image of it. And similarly, on the Pythagorean life, chapter 25 is followed immediately by a technical account of Pythagoras' discovery of the principles of harmony in chapter 26. So in both those parts of On the Pythagorean life, you've got, in fact, 2 levels of Pythagorean music. There's the therapy kind, and then there's this much more elevated kind, which involves the reasoning powers of the mind and the music of the spheres. Okay, let's go back now to a reply to Porphyry 3.9, number 2 on the handout. At the end of that passage, Iamblichus declares that the soul heard the divine harmony before it entered the body, and it recollects this when it hears tunes which preserve the divine trace of harmony. And you'll see that I picked out at the end of that, in the Greek, and I think in the translation as well. Yeah, and I tweaked the translation to make it clear. And say, I picked out the words aspadzotai and oikeutai, because those are the words that are used by Plato in Republic 3, 402a, in that passage about those who are being correctly educated, welcoming and recognizing the affinity between their soul and true beauty. Now, we might, I mean, obviously we might be inclined to say, oh, but, you know, that's Republic Book 3, they haven't even got to the forms yet. How can that possibly be about something to do with recognizing the harmony of the spheres? I'm not here saying what is or is not the correct interpretation of Plato. I'm, if you like, thinking like a Neoplatonist. And it seems to me, I thought that echo is very interesting. I think Iamblichus is reading that passage, rightly or wrongly, perhaps wrongly, as being about the same kind of relationship to music as is alluded to later in Book 7 and in Book 10, and is developed much greater length in the Timaeus. Okay, so it's about the soul hearing the divine harmony before it enters the body. For a Neoplatonist, such recollection is an experience of a rational soul, right? It's pretty clear in the passage of the Pythagorean life, it's to do with the rational soul. And again, for the Neoplatonists, that goes back to one of the passages of the Timaeus I mentioned, 69c to 72d, where again it's made quite explicit that, just finding what I said about that, yes, it's the rational part of the soul that's composed of the circles of the same and the different. So all of that is happening at the rational level. And so for a Neoplatonist like Iamblichus, recollection of this divine harmony would belong at one of the higher levels of virtue, beyond both habituated and civic virtue. Now, I concede that, you know, there aren't explicit references here to the higher levels of virtue, but if you think about how it fits with the Neoplatonic understanding of the soul, it seems all to be very consistent. That it's the rational soul, I'd say the soul which would be the soul which on its own, without the emotions, is involved in purificatory virtue and the higher levels, contemplative virtue, and so on. It's the rational soul which is recollecting that divine harmony. Okay, so I think it's time to sum up. I've been arguing that Iamblichus uses the Aristotelian notion of catharsis in two different ways, and that these correspond to the different uses of the term by Aristotle himself in the Poetics and the Politics, respectively. In reply to Porphyry I.11, Iamblichus interprets a catharsis brought about by tragedy and comedy in ethical terms, regarding it as stabilizing and purifying the emotions, and helping to bring about the state of metriopatheia, which is characteristic of Neoplatonic civic virtue. But in 3.9 and in On the Pythagorean Life, Iamblichus accepts the idea found in the Politics that music can function as a kind of therapy for the emotions at the pre-rational level of habituated virtue. However, he rejects the application of this idea to religious rites and divine possession. So, you know, I think he's acknowledging that Aristotelian idea, he's understanding it, if you like, correctly, but he's saying that doesn't apply to religious rites and divine possession. And he's appealing instead to the kinship between harmony in the soul and the harmony of the universe, and to the parallel between music and mathematics, which also had deep roots in the Platonic tradition. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Are there any questions? I'm sure there are many, but please raise hands or use the chat box. Yes, Professor Scott, please.
Hello, sorry to jump in. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's fine, yeah.
I'm at an airport having to get on a plane in a few minutes, so I am being shameless and jumping to the head of the line. So I really liked your comment about Aristotle, the right pleasure, pleasure at the right time for the proper reason and so forth. In effect, the doctrine of the mean, which I have published is actually the correct response to Plato, because when it comes to the ethical treatments of the arts. So that's in book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics, chapter 10, and I can post a screenshot quickly in the chat. So I really like that because I think it's so crucial, and no one ever talks about it in the context of how Aristotle allegedly replies to Plato. So I'll post that. But my question then, so the other people can get on, is it can be shown, and I have shown it, that harmonia kairuthmos must mean music or song and dance in Plato's Laws, book 2 at 665a. If you don't translate it that way, you will have absurdities that no one has ever resolved. And this is actually based on a biological account that he gives earlier. He says children, you know, they jump chaotically, and when they put order into it, then that's what he calls dance or ordered body movement, ruthmos, right? Not rhythm, but dance. And likewise with harmonia, if they put order into their chaotic shouting and screaming, that becomes harmonia, which presumably means song or dance. So if you translate it that way, harmonia kairuthmos, you resolve a number of dilemmas that no one has ever solved. And in my publications, I've also shown that Aristotle always uses ruthmos as dance, as ordered body movement in the so-called Poetics, which has not one poem, right? Always in that, okay? As ordered body movement. And it also solves a number of dilemmas. So it just hypothesize for the moment to humor me that maybe that's right. Why would you say that, Dan, that music then for Plato is Pythagorean if these passages, so it's a biological predisposition to act. Your human nature is you want to put order into the sounds and the leaping movements. I mean, how does that impact your statement about Pythagoras being kind of a source? Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you. That's all really interesting. I mean, several comments. First of all, the first bit you said about the Aristotelian mean and interpreting the catharsis. I think there are quite a few people who interpret, modern scholars who interpret catharsis in the Poetics in those kinds of terms. I don't think I'm being original at that. About dance and the laws, yes, that's also really, really interesting. And
let me interject.
You're right.
Let me interject, if I may. I follow Petroszewski and their scholars now on 3 continents, 5 languages, who reject that Aristotle wrote the word catharsis in the definition of so-called tragedy. So it's not an issue of catharsis. It's simply an issue of the mean with pain and pleasure. So sorry, I should have added that little bit.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, that's another conversation that we should probably have another time.
Yeah.
Okay, because you said lots of really interesting things. About the laws and dance, yes. I think Plato's discussion there is really important, and I think it was important for the Neoplatonists, and it's rather neglected, although less so in recent years. I couldn't see. It might be if I went back and looked at the Iamblichus passages with the laws in mind, maybe I'd see something. I'd see allusions to laws too. Maybe I should have brought that in. And it may be that when Iamblichus is talking about religious rites, in fact, surely he's talking about people dancing as well as about music. So that may well be relevant. Whether I want to sort of buy your whole thing about harmonia and rhythmos actually being terms to do with dance, I don't know. Finally, about Pythagoreans, I wasn't claiming that what Plato has to say about physikē, I should really call it that, shouldn't I, rather than music, is Pythagorean. What I was saying was the later tradition, certainly from Plutarch onwards, regards these ideas as Pythagorean.
Okay.
So perhaps I didn't make that clear.
Thanks. That helps very much. Thank you.
Professor Dillon? Your microphone is off. You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry about that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to greet you and say how enjoyable that was. And actually, the first point I was going that interested me, you've really been discussing to a certain extent how can we hear?
Please pay attention to the information displayed on the screen.
Can we hear? Yes. Apropos of catharsis, I thought it was. I hadn't really referred to the fact, I suppose, that Iamblichus is perfectly prepared to accept the Aristotelian argument that contemplating actions and thoughts that are themselves reprehensible, as in tragedy and comedy and dance even, are good for just modifying the emotions. That's directly contradicting, I suppose, Socrates in Republic 3 and so on, just denouncing drama and that sort of thing. The dance in the laws is, of course, when properly structured, is very good for elderly gentlemen to, and that sort of thing, to all sorts of people to dance. Whereas Iamblichus certainly seems to be adopting the Aristotelian position that even listening to obscenities to a certain extent, is good in the way of letting off steam a bit. So that seems to be sort of advance or development on Plato's position, which is interesting. The other thing that I wanted to raise was the interesting way in which the various levels of virtue arose until we get Iamblichus' 7, because it always seemed to me that Plotinus in 1:2, in chapter 7, let's say, the end of it, when he's talking about the paradigms of virtue in intellect, I think his point is paradigms of virtues are not virtues, they're paradigms of virtue. But by the time we get to Porphyry Sententia 32, there are such things as paradigmatic virtues. And that just seems to me Porphyry's scholastic mind sort of imposing a structure on Plotinus that he didn't intend. And then once you have paradigmatic virtues, you can go on up and down, and natural virtues and and so on, theurgic virtues. But I don't think Plotti wanted to have a paradigmatic virtue as such. So those are just the thoughts that occurred to me.
Yes, no, thank you. I mean, I agree with what you're saying about the relationship between the Plotinus and the Porphyry. That seems very clear, and I know that I think that's what you said in your publications about it. And yeah, about Iamblichus and Catharsis. No, it is interesting. I mean, I didn't want to repeat what some people here have heard me talking about in a slightly different, going a different direction, looking in more detail about what Iamblichus and Proclus and Olympiodorus have to say about tragic catharsis. I mean, I think what's interesting is that they're all three picking up on, I think, on the Poetics. That's assuming that the word catharsis was used in the Poetics. They're all three picking up on it. But whereas Proclus, because he's commenting on Plato's Republic, is very clearly defending Plato, Iamblichus seems to be going the other way, perhaps because in a different context. And then it's less clear exactly what Olympiodorus' position is, because his account of it's very brief. So there's perhaps a bit of debate going on, or just adjusting what they say to the context that they're talking in, which it may be no more than that. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Tornese.
Good afternoon, Anne, and well, thank you very much for.
Hello, Sebastian. Very nice to see you.
Yes, nice to see you. And I wanted to mention the context of this Neoplatonic philosophy as Pythagorean, which is like a auditory metaphysics, not only like visual, like things are image of other things, like in the classical interpretation of Plato, but with the Pythagorean revival of Iamblichus, can we bring also this idea of, if it's also can be used in this context of the music therapy, and also the idea of that the world is a derivation from like a musical derivation or mathematical derivation, is in this the same context of auditory metaphysics. And in this context, I wanted to bring another text about the levels of or kinds of madness in Hermias' commentary of the Phaedrus.
Yes.
Because he says something that the poetic madness corresponds to the whole in the part. This Proclean distinction of wholes, the whole in the part belong to the muses, and it could be physical or the ethical also, but more natural virtue, because it's the whole in the parts. And then Dionysian telestic madness corresponds to the whole out of the parts, and it's also the intellective integration of the soul. It's more like rational virtue or contemplative. And the Apollonian madness, Hermias says that is the whole before the parts, is the metaphysical paradigmatic one, maybe the one that is before the whole. So those are levels also of integration that are levels of harmony. So could be this related to this kind of music therapy of higher levels of virtue or integration of the human nature.
Okay, no, thank you. I mean, those are really good points. I mean, sorry, are you finished? So yes, about auditory metaphysics, absolutely. And that's a very interesting aspect of this whole discussion. I hadn't thought about looking at the Hermeus on the levels of mania in relating that, well, either to wholes and parts or to the levels of virtue, but it may very well be, I mean, obviously you're pointing out the thing about wholes and parts in the text, it may very well be that it does relate to levels of virtue. I would certainly, once one starts sort of following these Neoplatonic systems and you find yourself thinking like a Neoplatonist, then, you know, it all, very often it all falls into place, though not always. Sometimes things don't actually quite fit together. So yes, I'll have another look at that. I haven't looked at that passage for a long time. I'll have another look and see whether it fits in with all of this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mention it because it's also in the context of telastic use of music, because Iamblichus is also mentioning sacred rites, and also telastikē must be related to Dionysian madness. So it would be interesting to take into
okay, yes. I mean, obviously that's in relation to telastic madness and the Phaedrus, but no, you're right. I think it probably is connected, and I should have another look. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Konstantinos Makris. Costa.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting lecture. I would like to make 3 small suggestions for your paper, but I will be brief, so in order not to take so much time. The first, the general idea is to mobilize the whole Iamblichian corpus in order to better understand what he's doing about catharsis. The first suggestion is to have a look at the chapter 16 of De Vita Pythagorica, paragraphs 68 and following, where there is a special chapter devoted to the ways Pythagoras introduced catharsis in his pedagogical curriculum, or in his pedagogical ways to virtue, etc. So this is the first thing. The second is related to your text, your main text, text 2. At the end, there is this criticism of seeing harmony, seeing the soul as harmony and rhythmos. Here you have parallels, as Professor Dillon very well knows, in the fragments of De Anima, Iamblichus's De Anima, where Iamblichus says that you have to approach the soul in a mathematical way, and discards the conception of the soul as harmony. And this is a very you find it very often in Neoplatonism from Plotinus onwards. You don't have to see in material terms the harmony of the soul. And the third thing is about hearing the music of the spheres, which is attributed to Pythagoras. And here we can, I don't say many things, but there is a very good article of by Domenico Mara again, bringing this title specifically, Hearing the Harmony of the Spheres in Late Antiquity. It's an article of 2007, where he goes very interestingly from Nicomachus of Gerasa through Iamblichus to Simplicius in order to study the different facets and aspects of this possibility of hearing the harmony of the spheres, which is attributed to exceptional beings like Pythagoras. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's all really useful. Certainly, I think, oh, it's awful. I can't remember whether I read that Domenico Mara. I've certainly seen a reference to it, and the other two points about other Iamblichus texts. That's really helpful. So thank you very much. I'll follow all of that up.
Professor Lautner.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the talk. I have one query, which is about the relation between the different virtues, different types of virtues, because and especially of purification. So would you agree that purified state entails emotional state? Because my impression that both historically speaking and in Iamblichus, what we can read in Pseudo-Simplicius' commentary on De Anima, we have a quite, so historically speaking, okay, the Stoic sage is apates, but he has or she has got eupatheia, good feelings. And Simplicius, or the commentator, whoever he is, says that in Iamblichus's view, reason penetrates the whole soul. Actually, it goes down to the arrangement of the body because it's also rationally arranged. So the soul has a kind of organic unity. It's not just one brick or another brick, but that's an organic unity. And if that's the case, then one might say that purified states is not states without emotions, but states with transformed emotions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No, it is very complicated. I mean, one of the interesting things is that when Iamblichus and other Neoplatonists use the term catharsis at what I think would be the lower levels of virtue, of course, that's not the same as catharsis at the level of purificatory virtue, which is the one that's for which the term apatheia is used, but in some ways it's very unlike Stoic apatheia because Neoplatonic psychology is so different. Yeah, I mean, I take your point about there is a sense in which this whole soul is rationally ordered, and I should look at the De Anima commentary and what's said there. As far as the purificatory virtue and that level of purification is concerned, yes, the emotions do seem to have some kind of role to play there, but not very much. And whether the Neoplatonists had something that's equivalent to eupatheia, I mean, that's another really interesting question. We're sort of moving off, which again, I've tried to have a look at. I think that perhaps they did. I mean, they do use the word sometimes,
yeah.
Not very often. And well, I think like Plato and like the Stoics, they have some difficulty, I suppose, in distinguishing between the kinds of emotions which they want to get away from, the ones in that list in the passage on the Pythagorean life, you know, grief, anger, all the rest of it, and some sort of, you know, good emotional states, the conventional English translation of eupatheia. You know, are there things like, for example, intellectual pleasure? There's a passage of Damascus that refers to eupatheia, yeah. Intellectual pleasure, eupatheia. Are there some things which, you know, even the Neoplatonic sage, as it were, some things that we would call feelings that they experience? It's a really interesting question. I'm not quite sure of the answer. I've made a little bit of an attempt to have a look at it. But yeah, so these are all things that I need to look at further. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Onassis.
Thank you for your talk. A little bit maybe a general question. When we, it was always strange and something for me when the Neoplatonists are talking about music, they seems to think about contemplating and calculating music rather than hearing. It's like even speaking about the cathartic power of music and all this thing, they are seems to look at say mathematical proportions and harmonies rather than so. Do you think that Neoplatonic musical theory, so to say, is about contemplating rather than hearing and performing?
That's a very interesting point, and I mean, I think there might be other people here who
very small point.
No, that is interesting. I mean, I think the contemplating doesn't necessarily exclude hearing. I guess you could be. I mean, this is part of what Sebastian Moritonesi was saying about auditory metaphysics, I think, and he's probably a better place to comment on this than I am. But I take it that you could be. The idea is that when you're listening to the music, you are, if you're doing this in the higher kind of way, you're not just having an emotional reaction to it. You are, it is, if you like, a kind of contemplation for hearing it and grasping the mathematical basis of it. But of course, they also seem to think that you can be doing this, that the very highest kind of musical, in quotes, contemplation would actually be complete silence. So that's sort of going in your direction. Sebastian, I don't know if you want to comment on this, because as I say, you know more about this than I do.
Well, yeah, I would say that Plato in the Timaeus says that there is one way of listening to music at the end of the Timaeus, that is music with logos. So you can listen to music with logos, not in an allogon way. So, and also if music was used in Eleusis or in other sacred rites, the Neoplatonists will say that hearing that kind of music was affecting not only one part of not only the body, but also the whole human being. And so in that way, music that you can hear is also important for the Neoplatonists, I will say.
So it's not just,
Thank you.
It's not just contemplation.
Yeah. And also in the Renaissance, like Ficino was playing his lyre, and he was like a Neoplatonist also, no? Like he was playing hymns, and Proclus composed hymns to the gods. There were hymns that you can listen to.
Thank you. So Professor Finamore, John.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Good paper, and I've learned a lot from it. I've got a kind of crazy left field notion I want to run past you. I'll make you my arbiter intelligendi, if you will. And that is that looking at what you're talking about, especially at the lower level below the purificatory virtues, where you're trying to control people who are having irrational outbursts. There are obviously good things in the Pythagorean life, but there's also the stuff about the Downian bear who's kind of crazy out there and killing things in the field and destroying cities. There's a bull that's kind of wild because he's eating beans, and we're going to stop him from doing that. And there's an eagle, right, that's flying around. We have to do something. Anyway, in all these cases, Pythagoras uses voice, but it's clearly not logos voice. It's something else to control them and to sort of harmonize them and bring them back to where they belong. And I don't know if that would fit into this general pattern that you're talking about. It interests me very much because, you know, I've written on this subject too. So what do you think about the Downian bear?
I'm not sure I thought about the Downian bear as such, but no, I think so. I mean, I think, again, I need to check the passages, but some of the stories that turn up in the later Neoplatonic commentators about music therapy, they're about this sort of thing as well, about calming animals and so forth. So I think it would fit into that context, yes. And again, I think that would be consistent with what I was arguing, wouldn't it? That this would be the music as therapy kind of thing, which is the emotions, and obviously animals don't have, from Neoplatonic perspective, animals don't have the reasoning powers that human beings do, but you can have an effect on them on that, because they have emotion, they have emotions and so forth. So yes, that seems to fit in.
Yeah, that gives you a way of sort of approaching the logical level. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. If there are no questions for the moment, I have a question, a small one. If I may, Anne.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. So I'm wondering about Republic 449. This is the passage where Plato says that justice and in a way virtue is a kind of harmony of the three parts of the soul. And of course, for the Neoplatonic philosophers, the soul does not have parts unless it is taken in relation to the body. However, I was wondering about the reception of these passages of the Republic, and when I was reading the handout, I thought that I found an echo of this passage in text number 3, where it is said that the original harmony of the soul's powers was restored, harmonie ton tis psychis dynameon, os perichon ex archis. So this, I thought it could be a reading of Republic 443 and not 9, as I said before. Read in as being in agreement with what Aristotle says, that there are powers of the soul, but not really parts, and also the Timaeus, where our aim in life is to regain the original state of our soul. So I was wondering about these ideas of virtue as a kind of harmony.
I think that is possible, yes. I mean, I think one would need, I guess, to put it together with, sorry, somebody earlier on the discussion, I've now lost track of who it was, perhaps, was mentioning the discussion in the fragments of Iamblichus' commentary in the De Anima about the idea that about soul and harmony. So I think one would need to, I'd need to look, follow that up, we need to look rather carefully at that as to, what exactly does Iamblichus mean about harmonia ton tis psychis dynameon, and about the sort of kind of resonances both of harmonia and, as you say, of dunamis. I mean, I suppose one of the difficulties, I think, for what I was trying to argue is that the texts I was talking about, both the reply to Porphyry and on the Pythagorean life, are not written in a very kind of technical way, which makes them in a way accessible, I suppose, to readers. But then if you start trying to see them in the sort of terms of technical distinctions, such as are used by the Aristotelian commentators, indeed by Proclus, and also to some extent certainly by Aristotle and sometimes by Plato, it gets quite difficult. I mean, you could be accused of pushing it too far because how I mean, it's very interesting. There are these echoes of Platonic Aristotelian texts in the Iamblichus text, and yet, as I say, he's not using language in a very technical way. So I'm just feeling a bit cautious about that, but it's certainly something that would be worth looking at further.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions or topics to discuss? Or if not, then Anne, Professor Sheppard, thank you very much for this wonderful talk and for the rich discussion, for answering all these questions. And thank you all for being here and for the discussion. Let us renew our appointment for the 23rd of May and Professor Michael Griffin's talk on ladders of virtue and inspiration. Thank you very much, Professor Sheppard. Thank you all once again, and see you very soon.
Thank you all for a very good discussion. Thank you.